Folks, welcome back to the show where sometimes our signals get crossed, but our swords always do. Let's bring in our phenomenal panel here. First, you know him, the man with the greatest takes in Western New York, the man working UB, working Bills, working Sabres, Mike Bunt. Welcome to the show. How are we doing today? We got the mute monster going already.
Doing good, but could always do better if the Sabres could finally get some wins. The mute button. I can't believe I let it get to me.
Maniac's gone, but the mute monster stays here. And a man who brings joy and positivity to every show he's on. A man who runs the Sabres Twitter. The man who is the voice of Canisius. Intern Vinny, how are we doing today, sir?
Oh, I'm glad to be back on with everybody. I am definitely looking forward to bringing more smiles and positive outlook to each and every single one of these that I'm able to make. So, but excited to see your smiling faces again. It should be fun. Hopefully, a little more fun than these hockey games have been.
And gentlemen, speaking of smiling starts and things we're happy about, the Sabres are 1-4-1 to start the season. I don't think that's what any of us wanted, any of us expected. But how are we feeling about the Sabres team only 6 games into the year?
I'm feeling awful. It's been a horrific start to the season, especially for someone that went out on the limb and picked them to make the playoffs this year. So not feeling too great about them. I was very high on the possibility of having bounce back seasons for guys like Dylan Cousins, having Jack Quinn back in the lineup. That hasn't gotten off to a great start. I thought the penalty kill would be improved with guys like McLeod in the penalty kill. Greenway I thought would look good, and he's been great so far. One of the few solid players on the Sabres, but the penalty kill, other than that, has been awful. The power play with Seth Appert, that was supposed to be better. We're still looking for a power play goal. They might get to 0 for 20 before we see one. And I guess the one positive, since we are the quote-unquote positive Sabres podcast, is that at least 5-on-5, they're producing at a solid rate. I believe they're something like second in the NHL in goals on 5-on-5, and they have a top 10 expected goals rate on 5-on-5, but every other aspect of their game, whether it's power play, penalty kill, goaltending, has just been horrific. And the fact that they can't get the goaltending to match up when they're scoring goals, or they can't score goals when they get the goaltending, it just feels like a lot of the same old with this team.
Yeah, when you sort of look at the microcosm of these games, I think there's definitely a tendency, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit later, for people to maybe overreact to the relatively poor record, of course, to start the season. But again, I think it would be unfair in the grand scheme of things to say that, hey, well, it's the Sabres, like, just because these few games haven't gone great, like, there's still, 77 games, 76 games left to go in the season. Don't worry about it, right? But at the end of the day, like, enough years of, well, okay, it's just one, we missed the playoffs one year in 2013, not a big deal. And then, well, we missed them again. Now we have Jack Eichel, so we'll make the playoffs. Missed by a little bit. Tough injury luck this year. We missed by one more game. If they would have canceled the season 18 hours later and let us play the Penguins, we would have won and been in the extended playoffs, and we could have been the Montreal Canadiens. But again, like, now you're looking at a decade and a half almost of to one extent saying, well, there's still that window of opportunity, and then eventually it runs out, when the team inevitably gets hot in March. So I definitely don't feel great, but I admit that there's a little bit more indifference than usual in my view of how these games are going, to be honest.
Yeah, and this might not be the time for this, but that might be one of the biggest what ifs in Sabres history, at least in recent history, of what if they got into that bubble and went on that run Montreal did. Like, this Sabres team.
Asterisks.
Yeah.
Wouldn't have counted.
But even just from the players' perspective, would we move on from these guys? Would they find some success? Questions for another day. But yeah, the start to the Sabres season is tough. I know, but now we put our necks on the line early on the season talking about how this team is going to be different. And, we can really nitpick and find some areas that they're different, but at the end of the day, it's really hard to not say it's the same old Buffalo Sabres when they're blowing games that they're scoring 6 goals or 5 goals, where they're doing things that they've been doing for years that continue to kill them. They're going down that front, and because of that, fans are angry. Bunt, do we think fans deserve to be angry 6 games into the season with how things are going right now?
100% they have a right to be angry. This team was supposed to be different this year with Lindy Ruff coaching behind the bench. They improved their bottom six, and they're off to a 1-4-1 start. I don't care that some of their metrics are looking better. The fact is, this team has gotten off to an awful start to their season, and they're already putting themselves in a hole. And they know the situation with this fan base. We're fed up with the losing. We're fed up with the playoff drought. And any little chance of creating some optimism is absolutely gone now. So, yes, fans absolutely have a right to be angry. Now, if we're being rational about the team and talking about a 1-4-1 record through 6 games, is the season over? Nowhere even close to being over. Can they rebound and get back on track? Absolutely they can. But when you have 13 years of disappointment, that's hard to tell most fans that are just used to seeing this crap on a yearly basis. So in the past, if this was last year and we're 1-4-1 at this point, coming off a 91-point season where you missed the playoffs by 1 point, I'm probably telling people at this moment in time, relax. The metrics look okay. The 5-on-5 is solid. The penalty kill and the power play can't get much worse than what they are. So if they can figure that out, there is some room for optimism, and you have a coach that's probably going to bring some structure. So if I was just a fan of a normal organization, not battling with a historic drought, I'd probably say give it some more time. But that's not our situation. So that's not what fans are thinking. And if this losing streak or this losing continues another 2 or 3 games and it continues to the 10-game mark, well, a lot of people are going to think this season is over before it even gets started.
Yeah, and I say this, I feel like every year. This has now been, I feel like more than just a couple years that we've started the season and, on the Crossing Swords podcast. And I've said this exact point, which is early in the NHL season, I think a lot of fans, especially in those cities that share teams, which is quite a decent amount of them, that you have an NFL bias, which is that in the beginning of the season, if your team starts the year off with a couple of losses, you're sort of inundated with in the National Football League, if you're 1-4 to start the year, the chance of you making the playoffs are slim to none. Just statistically, it does not happen very often. And so when that happens in the NHL, I think you have a tendency to sort of think that's the same thing. And while certainly there are some stats to show that, like, hey, look, when a team starts 1-4, more often than not, they finish at or below 500 at the end of the year and also miss the playoffs. But it's way more common in the NHL to have, a bad slump and to maybe start the year not off right and then eventually figure things out. So, yeah, I will say, look, like in a bubble, don't panic, right? I don't think there's reason to panic because hockey is completely different than many other sports. I mean, it's one of the only ones played on ice, right? But in all seriousness, like you do have, again, like I sort of said in the last question when I wasn't answering the question that was asked, which is how do I feel? My eventual answer was indifferent because I can't tell if I really care or not yet about what's happening. And the reason for that is trying to decipher between am I mad about the losses because it's just like, am I tacking it on to like last season, and the seasons prior, or am I actually mad about the losses and I'm, just looking at the NHL season in the light that technically it's supposed to be looked through. Whether that's how much that's going to eventually like boil to the top over the next couple games as they may or may not figure out how to win or not play terrible special teams. We'll see.
Yeah. I mean, any other team starts 1-4-1, it's a disappointment for a fan base, but I can't imagine any other fan bases where, it's as justified to be angry as it is for these Sabres fans, where we're told each offseason that it is going to be different. You bring a new coach in, you got some new pieces in, you got a brand new roof as well. Can't forget about the new roof, the Jeff Skinner Memorial scoreboard as well. Like these are things that drum up interest in this team. And something that's very difficult for this franchise to do in the past decade is to get interest from the city of Buffalo, especially when the Bills have been the team they've been the past 5-6 years. And to squander that hype that has been built this offseason with nostalgia, with Ruff, is such a massive letdown, where we know this team at some point in their 82-game season will go on like a 1-4-1 stretch. But to start your year like that, to start on the national stage in Prague, to lay 2 goose eggs there and just kind of kill any momentum that this organization needed is really heartbreaking. And just fans being angry is, I feel like, a natural part of being a Sabres fan at this point, where whether it's the start of the year where the team goes on like a 7-1-1 start to the season and then loses 10 straight, or they start off slow, people get mad and people want changes. And some of those changes now, we're seeing guys like Casey Middlestat go have 4 goals in 5 games. Reinhart, Eichel leading a top 10 in the league in points. Like, our team is moving on from guys and they're finding success. Do we think that, Bunt, do we think that's an issue with the Sabres organization itself, fans pushing people aside? Like, why do we see so many former Sabres find success quickly after leaving Buffalo?
Well, it's because a lot of the players that leave Buffalo are actually solid players, but they were just playing in a crap situation for the beginning parts of their career. And the Sabres bring out the worst in these guys. There's a lot of factors. I'll try to keep this as condensed as possible. The Sabres for several years were impatient in several phases, which led to constantly making changes to their roster, their coaching staff, GMs, which basically brought in a bunch of different players that didn't fit the styles, didn't complement each other. And what that leads to is a lot of bad hockey. And then when these guys go to other organizations that fit their skill sets, that fit what they do, you start seeing the best versions of them. Ryan O'Reilly, Jack Eichel, Sam Reinhart, Montour, now looks like Casey Middlestat. And what also happens with the Sabres during this time is that in recent years, they've tried to build through youth, not just making that big trade for an Evander Kane or O'Reilly and so forth, a Skinner. And when you're building with youth, it takes time. It doesn't take 1 or 2 years. It takes 3 or 4 years. But when you're doing that with an organization that has a historic playoff drought, there is no patience in the fan base for development. So you get on players when they're 22, 23, 24 years old, and you think these guys suck. Look at all the mistakes. And you harp on every little thing that these players do wrong. And what happens is you have a guy like Cousins right now who feels the weight of the world on his shoulders, probably the same with Jack Quinn. And you don't see it with Kulich and Benson because they're too young to have gone through the years of criticism. They're still given basically breaks by the fan base when they make mistakes because they're the new guys, they're the fresh faces. But what happens is with the Cousins, the Quinn, they make mistakes. Fan bases were just killing these guys. And yes, like the mistakes are bad. But if you would have built the roster properly and complemented them with solid veterans, so a Cousins could have been a third liner early in his career instead of being forced to be a $7 million a year overpaid second liner, the expectations would be lower. You're not going to then kill these guys. And then what will happen is a guy like Cousins, I'm not saying this will happen, but he'll go to another franchise that will put him in the right spot. And then suddenly you'll see him be a 25 goal scorer, 55 points plus 7 player. And you're going to be like, why didn't that happen in Buffalo? Well, because we mismanaged him the entire time. And then we ruined these guys. And believe me, these players are all feeling the weight of the world on their shoulders. There is no rational, sane reason for any player to be smashing a stick on a goalpost at the end of a game 3 or 4 games into a season. And we have already seen 3 Sabres smash their sticks through the first 6 games of the season. That tells me this team is tense. This team is feeling the weight, and they are not being able to play freely, which is the worst thing for a young, talented team, because really we should be encouraging them to find the best versions of themselves. And instead, they're just afraid of making mistakes on the ice.
I say that's such a great point. I think you made like 6 points that I very much agree with. And I'm going to try to go back and say the previous ones first. And I will admittedly start with something that I agree with, but unfortunately, like, to put into perspective, don't know that you can change, which is that, yeah, the Sabres have had to make a very significant carousel from time to time. And depending on how you look at it, some might say that didn't happen enough. I mean, you can think back to the days, right, of, Gergensen was on this team for a long time, and Ristolainen was on this team for a long time. And you had some fans saying, like, look, these guys can't just, well, Ristolainen is slightly different, but Gergensen was someone who you heard his name a lot after he signs these short contracts back to back to back to stay with the team.
He's a fabric guy.
And it's like, look, like Zemgus is a high effort hockey player, the Latvian locomotive. Anytime Buffalo fans interacted with him, it was always positive. And I think the issue there, though, is that he was just like on the team that lost a lot, and therefore, like, you can sort of associate this player with losing. And so when he gets re-signed a couple of times, some of the fans might say, look, like, they're just willing to keep these same guys around. And maybe that's true, maybe it's not. I think, like, there's that long adage of, like, if you look for things around you that are blue, you're going to find a lot of blue things. You're not going to notice the red things, and you're going to say things are blue that aren't actually blue just because you're looking for blue. So I think in that situation, you can look for what you want to see, and you're probably going to see it, especially if it's negative in regard to the Buffalo Sabres. But the NHL, and this goes back to the point you're originally making, is a league that has a lot of turnover. Like, there's just a constant cycle of players leaving, going somewhere else. The coaching carousel is ridiculous. 13 teams, 14 new head coaches over the past 2 seasons alone. And that doesn't even include the season prior, where after the turn of the 2023 new year, we had other new coaches, including like Vancouver, who was unbelievable after they changed their coach. I mean, so that's almost half of the entire NHL has switched the main position of influence on the bench on the last 2 seasons alone. That's just like the teams that don't make the postseason. It's just like every single one of them has like made a switch, right? And it's crazy to think that there's that much turnover. And maybe this isn't the right word, but impatience is something that just exists, and it's just embedded within the way the league works. So yeah, I think the Sabres have, like you mentioned, Mike, they've really leaned into that, like, youth, like, try to develop these players, get them in Rochester, get them to grow, and then bring them to the NHL and sort of like develop that philosophy. And maybe they haven't been patient enough, but the league says you almost can't be, which is unfortunate.
I do want to just say one thing before you go, Gatesy. I agree. My thing really isn't that they haven't been patient enough. I think they have been very patient with this group. I think the impatience was the first 7-8 years of the drought, when they wanted the Jack Eichel, Sam Reinhart teams to be competitive right away. And that's what led to firing Bilesma and then overreacting and making an entire system change to a Phil Housley, who then made them defensively irresponsible. And then you already tried a defensively responsible coach for an offensive system, to then a positive motivator, to then a guy that can develop and be patient with the young guys, to now you're taking the guy that wants to hold them accountable. There's been a reaction to every prior change, instead of trying to find the guy that's going to build the right culture and build it organically the right way. What I would say is the mistakes of the earlier administrations have led to the problems right now, because there's things that were actually done properly early on that fans now won't let them do, because we think that they're doomed to fail that way. So, like, when you look at this team, the last couple of years, these young players are good. They've been high round draft picks, but what should the Sabres have done? They should have probably made a trade or two for some top 6 forwards to supplement Thompson and Tuck and some of those guys. They should have brought in some veteran defensemen that aren't Eric Johnson, who have bad underlying metrics. But what happened is the losing has extended so long that nobody wants to be a part of this organization, because it's a losing culture. It's a small city. It's a cold weather city in a place where there's not a lot to do. You have New York State taxes, and then you have a fan base, and this isn't an insult to them, but it's very toxic right now. So a lot of players, they say they don't want to play in a Montreal or a Toronto at times, because there's always this expectation that you have to win the cup every year. And if you don't, there's a lot of anger. Well, you get all that anger and resentment in Buffalo, minus the history, minus the perks of being in a major city, and minus the good weather playing elsewhere. And then you have the New York State taxes on top of it. So they're basically forced into the situation of we have to add to this roster, but nobody wants to be part of it. And the last thing I'll say before tossing the Gatesy, look at the NHL in the last 5 years. For whatever reason, it used to be the league had all this parity where bad teams can get good teams go bad. That hasn't been the case in the Eastern Conference. How long has Ottawa, Detroit, Montreal, Buffalo, Columbus, Philly been bad? The Eastern Conference has been the haves and the have-nots for the last 5 years. And I think what we're seeing is it's sometimes you're just playing in a division where you got Boston, Tampa Bay, Toronto, and Florida. And how are you going to break through? It's tough.
Exactly. You see with those teams that have broken through, like a Florida, they understood where their issues were and made big moves. You see them bring in Tkachuk from Calgary. You see them making moves to grow their success and realize they're really good NHL teams. And we might have good players here, but are they great players that are going to get us over that hump? And I think us as Buffalo fans, I know I'm super guilty of it. We see these prospects and we fall in love with them, and we believe that they can be the people that break the drought, and we want to have that attachment to them, and that they're going to be the guys that can lift this city out of this desperation to make the playoffs and, go on a playoff run, bring a championship to Buffalo. But at the end of the day, these guys need to produce, and we keep seeing it time and time again where these younger players will have a good season, a couple of good seasons in Buffalo, and then the wheels just kind of fall off for the whole team, and they're cast to the wayside, and next thing you know, they're lifting a cup elsewhere, they're finding success there. And I think we're going to see a lot of that right now with someone like a Dylan Cousins, where we saw 2 years ago put up really good numbers. Last year, a setback year, which I think a lot of people did predict, and this year it's almost getting even worse for him. How would you guys go about the whole Dylan Cousins situation? There's talks of moving him to wing, trying to reunite the kids line again, sending him to God knows where. But we're intern Vinny, let us go. What would you want to do with a guy like Dylan Cousins right now?
Well, I do really like a couple of those ideas, and unfortunately, you can't really do them all at the same time. I'm just going to quickly, and I promise I mean quickly, add a point because I didn't remember to say this about Middlestat. He's having a great start to the year so far in Colorado. The Avalanche are 1-4 right now with a -11 goal differential. So I just want to interject that to do the opposite of what is typically my tendency to say. Don't get me wrong. It's a shame as a Sabres fan to see Middlestat not be here and scoring points and having success elsewhere because you want a player like that. But just because he's doing well doesn't mean the team is doing well. And you just got to win games, right? Right now for the Sabres, it doesn't really matter how you win. You just have to win. So take the Casey Middlestat points with a little bit of a grain of salt because the Avalanche need to figure things out. And yet, again, the point that I made earlier is that, hey, just because they're 1-4 does not mean they're going to be bad. I mean, look at the bottom of the NHL right there. Edmonton's 2-3. So, yeah, Jeff Skinner, cool, scoring goals. He's on the top line there. They're a bottom 6 team in the NHL right now. You already see Colorado's just got their first win. I mean, so San Jose's got Macklin Celebrini, and they're 0-3-2. He's on IR right now. The Predators, who were a wild card team last year, are 0-4 right now. That's another team that made a coaching change before, not this season, but the season prior. And right now they haven't gotten a win yet. I don't know. I think most NHL fans don't care what this looks like right now. Because you look at this, and again, this goes back to the point that you were making, Mike, about the lack of parity in the Eastern Conference, is that people are going to look and be okay, yeah, Buffalo's going to hang out down there probably. We'll see if Philly gets any better, maybe. San Jose's probably going to be down there. They got to figure some stuff out still, but Colorado will figure it out, and Edmonton's going to figure it out, and Vancouver was really, really hot. They'll figure it out. I think that most people are just inclined to believe that things will stay the way they are, and so I will add, if Colorado can figure it out and Philadelphia can maybe figure it out and Vancouver can figure it out, it's really hard to, it's easier to said than done, but you can also just figure it out. There's so much time left, but I'll move on because it wasn't as quick as I thought it was. I love the idea of moving Cousins to wing. I really like that. Take some responsibility off of him and just let him maybe simplify the game a little bit. I think there's definitely a point where Cousins is overcomplicating things, and then he's getting in his own head a little bit. He seems like he's afraid to shoot at times. So just get this guy on the wing, get him in some scoring positions, and take some of the defensive responsibility off of him, even though that's something he typically does well. Maybe that'll alleviate some of the pressure, help him get outside his own head, and then maybe that will lead to results. The second point I like is getting that kids line back together. Offensively, the last 2 games, it has not been like the forward lines that have been the problem because they've been scoring. Now, maybe their defensive responsibilities have been lacking a little bit, sure, but I think getting that kids line together with Peterka, who's doing well, Quinn, who's struggling, and Cousins, who's struggling, might just help them maybe relive a little bit of that success we enjoyed so much when that line first got together.
Yeah, I like a lot of the points you just brought up. Maybe moving him to wing would help him out, especially from a lesser responsibility aspect. It feels like Cousins is definitely pressing on the ice quite a bit, and you could see his frustration where he feels the weight. He wants to be a leader on this team. He wants to be part of the change and the turnaround, but it just hasn't been happening. And what I found interesting when I've seen some of the metrics with Dylan Cousins over the last 3 years is everybody points out how he was dynamite 2 years ago with the 30-plus goals and close to 70 points. But if you actually look at his advanced numbers, they're actually very comparable the last 3 years. So even though he had much more points 2 seasons ago, a lot of his expected goals and chances and everything, they didn't change much from three years ago to 2 years ago to last year. His shooting percentage kind of just was at a super high rate 2 years ago and got hot, and things kind of just gelled. And what I wish never happened is I wish Jack Quinn never had the Achilles injury, because I really do think we'd be looking at things a lot differently. Him being out at the beginning of last year kind of ruined all the momentum for that kid line. And Peterka has since elevated himself to the point where you kind of have to have him with Thompson and Tuck because he's become one of the most valuable contributors on the team. And I think the whole time you had the kid line together, the thought was that Cousins was going to be kind of that two-way player who was going to contribute, and his scoring kind of came sooner than what was expected. Quinn was going to be the sniper down the line, and Peterka was going to be the valuable two-way guy who probably had the lowest upside of the three, but was going to be a valuable NHL middle six player. And now it's turned out where Peterka is probably the highest upside. We don't know what you have in Quinn. And Cousins is just, he's in the doghouse of the entire fan base. I still have a lot of hope for Cousins. I just wish they didn't elevate him to the second line so early in his career. I think that Cousins, Quinn, Peterka could have been a great third line for this team. And because of decisions by management, they were forced into a second line role way too quickly in their careers. And that has had this impact where now you kind of feel like you have to keep them there. When in reality, I think playing on the third line would probably suit Cousins better at this moment in time. But when you're paying him $7 million a year, you don't have the flexibility to really put him on the third line unless you want to switch things up and put McLeod on the second line. And McLeod has shown to be a valuable contributor. I think McLeod right now probably is more deserving of being on the second line. But then you look at Zucker and Greenway and how well they're playing with McLeod, and you don't want to break that up. So it's like, it's tough because I think right now our second line is a bunch of guys that should be probably playing the third line. But then you have two third lines really in reality. And it's, how do you fix it? I think right now you probably have to keep the first line intact. You probably have to keep the third line intact. And you have to basically tell Cousins, play free. Don't worry about mistakes. Stop feeling the weight of this fan base. And basically, I don't know what you do. I really don't know what you do besides try to get him more help, get him a veteran, make a move, make a trade, do something to take some of the weight off of him, because you're playing him with kids. And if Quinn is going to make the stupid mistakes that he's making, Cousins is not getting the help he needs. So either Quinn, Cousins, maybe you need to separate them at some point so you don't have the constant mistakes being made on a ship by ship basis.
Yeah, I think I just want to add, and this time I promise to be quick, I feel like you do have to do something with the lines, just because, again, and I'd love to hear this like whole episode if I've contradicted myself like 6 or 7 times already with like my perspective. And I just mentioned like a minute and a half ago, you just have to win somehow, right? And right now you're not really doing that. And when you think of the game of hockey in phases, right now, the past 2 games, it's been in your offensive phase that's been working really well. And it's been your defense and your goaltending and your special teams that have been poor. So like, while, yeah, technically speaking, you'd think let's not change the offensive phase because it's kind of working. It's not though, because you're not winning. So maybe making some sort of change with the lines, and that's, I'm not saying your point about switching, putting Cousins with different players or down. I'm agreeing with that. But I think like, I don't hate the idea of just switching up the first or the third line because like right now you're just losing. You got to figure out how to win somehow.
Vinny, the tough part though is when you look at the 5-on-5, they're fourth in certain metrics. They're tied for second with 14 goals. They're 10th in expected goals for percentage. They're generating chances. They're outplaying their opponents 5-on-5 on most nights. Not against the Devils early on, but since they've come back to the States, they played better than the Penguins 5-on-5. They lost that game because of penalties and poor goaltending. The last game against Columbus, Levi had an expected goals of 1.96. He allowed 6 goals. Like, that's horrendous. That's awful. So like, sometimes the raw numbers will tell you like, okay, this is something to be encouraged by, and it helps you isolate why are you losing. Well, you're losing because your goaltending has been horrific. You're making bad turnovers that are leading to goals for the other team, and your special teams has been horrendous. If you can figure out your power play, you will be winning some of these games. If you figure out your penalty kill, you will be winning some of these games. Same with goaltending. So I think what it ultimately comes down to, don't make a change just for the sake of making a change, because yes, the Cousins Quinn line is awful right now, but your top line is doing their job. Tage Thompson has 3 goals, but Turka's putting the puck in the net. Do you want to interrupt that at this moment in time? I'm not sure you do. And then with the third line with Greenway, McLeod really generating some opportunities, you break that up. You have you risk not only still continuing to struggle on special teams, but then you risk not generating anything offensively at all. And I guess you could say 1-4-1. How can it get any worse?
Right.
Well, you're 1-4-1 and you have 14 goals the last 3 games. You could then go forward and not score at all and be even worse. Like, there's 2 ways of looking at it. You could say we got to make changes, we're losing games. Or you could look at it as, if we continue to produce at this rate 5-on-5, that's eventually going to lead to wins when we make some improvements with our special teams and our goaltending. So for now, I think you stick with it. And if the losing continues another 3-4 games and you get into an even further rut, then you make changes. But right now, I think the 5-on-5 numbers are too good for the rest of the team to really risk tampering with the other couple lines.
Yeah, and winning cures all ailments right now for this team, and having the start they have puts such a bigger lens on that second line, on Quinn and Cousins. And my biggest thing with Cousins right now, he's getting the chances. He's just not bearing it away. So he gets one. I think the floodgates for him are going to open. That confidence is going to come back, because it's not like he's not seeing any chances at all. He's just a ghost. He has some good chances, had some breakaways, some good shots. He just can't find the back of the net. And he's a guy that I believe once he gets hot, he kind of builds off that. That line will build off that. And if the Sabres can get some secondary scoring from that second line, like, that's going to be a massive improvement as well. Grant, the power play is over a trillion. Like, you get a couple extra goals there. We're not talking about the second line really at all. We're like, that sucks, but it wouldn't be a focus on anyone's mind of moving Cousins to wing, doing like all this and that. Winning cures all. And I think for that second line too, it's just finding rhythm, finding consistency, and just getting a couple to get the monkey off their back where they can start scoring again and going from there. But speaking of your Sabres, tonight in Chicago, they're favored in this game. How are you feeling about this game? Any score predictions, fellas? And do we think the Sabres are going to bounce back after their back-to-back 6 spots they've given up defensively?
Well, the Sabres are favored tonight, and that's something, because that doesn't happen often. And if you see the Sabres favored, there's normally a reason why. I looked earlier tonight. I think it was Sabres minus 130. Now it's Buffalo minus 150. So they're not just favored tonight. Like, they're a considerable favorite tonight, which I don't know. Maybe Vegas I always say Vegas knows something. So that alone gives me enough confidence to pick Buffalo to win tonight. Over unders 5.5 goals. I could see the Sabres getting like a 4-2 win tonight.
I also have some feeling that the Sabres will win. I feel like it's going to be a similar game script to how it's gone maybe the past 2 games. I could see the goaltending being a little bit better. I could see the goal scoring being somewhat similar. But I am weary of a back and forth game. With that said, I have a 5-4 Sabres win feeling, but I feel like it's going to be in regulation, and I feel like it might be one of those like it's 5-3 like late, and like Chicago pulls a goalie and gets one with like 18 seconds left just to make it a 1-goal game. But like you said, like the Sabres have been playing well, and you play 5-on-5 for the majority of the hockey game. That's not nothing. So if they can continue that tonight against Chicago, I do have a feeling that they'll get back in the win column.
Yeah, I agree. I think UPL's in net tonight, first goalie off of practice. So I think he's a guy that's going to bounce back as well, kind of with the Sabres struggle. We saw last year when they needed him the most, he did step up. And if they get that performance out of him tonight where he can just steal them a game, that's going to go a long way into giving this whole team confidence. So, yeah, I'm with you guys. I think the Sabres are going to figure something out because, again, it's not like they haven't been scoring either the past 2 games. They've been finding the back of the net. They just need a save in some capacity. So, yeah, I'm going like 5-2 Sabres win. I think the offense is going to be there. I'm going to have probably the hottest take of the year right now. I think the Sabres are going to score a power play goal tonight. I think it's going to happen. They're going to finally be like 1% on the year. But I think
it should then be taken away with an offsides challenge.
That might be the most like Sabres thing to happen. Most just like, yeah, all that makes sense. So I think that could be in store for tonight. But yeah, I think the biggest thing for this team is just getting a win, finding some resiliency, and you're not giving up 6 goals tonight. That could be a good takeaway. Stay out of the penalty box as well, and that could be big. Make sure you're following myself, Gates35, at Mike Bunt, at VCristiano3. Thank you to our good fans at Outlet Liquor, the place to buy a case. And remember, our swords are always crossed, and our signals today, and because of the Sabres team, they have always been crossed as well. Let's go Sabres! Almost.